All right, where we left off last video, we were talking about sensory memory, right? So we're moving from sensory memory. We're moving from this spot right here over to this area. Very cool. All right, let's get into it. Short-term memory is this intermediary stage, and it's in this part of our mind, in this part of our memory, where we take what our sensory memory has held on to, which, remember, requires lots of attention. If you're paying attention to your senses, that information makes it into your short-term memory. I think about this kind of like it makes it into your mind's eye or your mind's ear, where if you are thinking about what you're hearing, it's kind of in your consciousness, you're now aware of it, right? That's short-term memory. So it's going to be this middle system that's going to be handling the transfer from this incoming sensory stimuli to long-term memory, which is something that is going to last, obviously is going to last longer, that you can recall, days, months, or years after the fact. So if information is held in short-term memory, then we can make it into a long-term memory. But it takes work. There's lots of different ways we can do that. Some of it is to pay attention. It's to rehearse it, to say it over to yourself. But there's also a couple of other strategies that we're going to look at in the next couple of chapters that are going to help illuminate ways that we can facilitate that transfer, that we can take things from short-term memory and make sure that it stays in our long-term memory. The capacity here is about 7 items plus or minus 2, which is, what George Miller said in 1958, 1957. But honestly, that quote-unquote magic number for short-term memory is probably shorter than that. A lot of more current research shows that it is probably more like 4 plus or minus 1, or even honestly maybe 3 plus or minus 1, depending on the researcher that's doing that stuff. It's just that we typically get things like 7 when we group things together or we use chunking. All right, so just repeated exposures to things does not actually mean that we are going to remember things better. So again, attention is really important, and I can give you an example. If I were to ask you to look at these pennies, and I were to ask you which of these is the real, honest-to-God penny, what would you say? Now, this is another one of the downsides to not having an in-person class, because whenever I show this to people are very, very confident in their answers, usually. And they're usually not right, too. When people see this, they think, it's probably this first one, right? And then I get somebody else in the corner who's like, no, it's this one right here. And I get somebody else who's like, no, it's this down here. Trust me, bro, I'm sure. I know that it says, in God we trust up here. I remember that stuff, bro. And, there's lots of friendly debate over it. In fact, the penny is this right here. And if you don't believe me, you can find a penny somewhere and you can look at it. But this is an example of how just simply being exposed to information is not going to increase the likelihood that you're going to remember the important things about it. You've seen pennies tons of times. You've seen pennies everywhere since you were a kid. But we don't remember what they actually look like. We know what they stand for. We know what they mean. We know what they're worth. But we don't actually know, the word liberty is behind Lincoln. The year it was minted is in front of him. It says the words, in God we trust. He's facing towards the right, etc. All these different things. What we mostly know is, it has Abraham Lincoln on it, and it's worth 1 cent. Okay. So this leads us into something called levels of processing. And levels of processing is a way to talk about how we can ensure that information is going to move from short-term memory to long-term memory. So levels of processing, there are 3 different levels. The visual level is the weakest. The semantic level is the deepest. So essentially, if you were to look at something and you're just looking at it, you're not really thinking about what it represents or what it is, you're just looking at its appearance, that is going to lead to the weakest level of encoding. You're probably not going to remember what that information is, a couple of hours later. The second weakest, or the second strongest, depending on your perspective, is the acoustic levels of processing. And in the acoustic levels of processing, that's where you think about what something sounds like. So you think about what those words sound like. But you may not think about what it means, or if it's important. And so you'll stand a higher likelihood of remembering it, but still not a great likelihood. The best way to encode this information is through the semantic level, and that's the deepest. And the semantic level is essentially going to be taking information and thinking about how it's relevant to you, thinking about where it fits into what you know about the world, and about what that information means. So here's how we know that. There's been a lot of studies that have tested this stuff out, but one of the most important kind of landmark studies here was through Craig and Tolving. This is 1975. So in the 70s they came up with this. I'm going to direct your attention to this figure on the right. They both say the same thing, but the figure on the right does a better job of illustrating it. Craig and Tolving, they had a test for people. They didn't know it was a memory test, but it was. And what they did is they brought people into a laboratory and they gave them a list of words. And they asked them, what we want you to do is to, and then they created 3 different conditions. One group was going to look at those words and determine whether or not there were any uppercase letters or any lowercase letters in that particular word. The second group was going to be asked whether or not that word rhymes with another word that was presented. So like the word here, and you had to judge, does activity rhyme with the word here? Does during rhyme with the word here? And so on. And then finally, another group was asked whether or not the current word fit into a specific sentence. So it could be something like, the little girl tripped over the blank. And, if you have the word rabbit, you could say, yeah, rabbit fits in there. Or if you had the word sky, wouldn't really work unless she was hallucinating or something, right? So those are some examples, those 3 different groups. And what they found, so again, they didn't tell participants that they were actually supposed to be remembering anything, but after they did this task, about 10 minutes later, they gave them a test. And they asked them, okay, tell us every single word that you remember from that test. And performance was not very good. People didn't know, right? They weren't prepared for it. They didn't know they were going to be tested on this stuff, so performance wasn't super good. But what we see is that those that were asked to judge a word based on its look, that visual encoding, had the worst performance. They only remembered about 10% of the words. Those that were asked to think about what the word meant, whether or not it fit into a sentence, was almost 25% of the words. So, that's twice and a half as well as the visual group. So quite a bit, right? That's a super big advantage. So again, if you're thinking about how you can apply these things to your own work or your own studies, think about, I always use the example of remembering definitions, because I remember whenever I was in college and I was trying to do well in classes, I would make flashcards. And if you make flashcards for definitions, you very quickly learn the definition based just on its look or just on how it sounds. So if you had, I'm trying to think of a good example. I'll just use one of these right here. So like, for example, if I'm using visual processing, means what the word looks like. And I'm looking at that on a flashcard, but I don't actually think about this context, like this whole study. I don't think about any of this stuff. I just think about what these words mean. I'm not going to really remember this stuff very well, especially if somebody were to ask me using different words what this information meant. I'm not going to know, right? And so for those of us that use flashcards, it can be really good. It can be really effective as long as we are tested on them using the same sentences, so the way that the sentences look or the way that the sentences sound, then our performance will be well. But if we are asked a question about what that word specifically means or asked to illustrate it, we don't do so well. And that's all because of this. All right, so this is called elaborative encoding, and essentially elaborative encoding is that the more work you put into remembering something, generally the more likely you are to remember it. This form of encoding illustrated here in this figure is pretty cool. Basically what they are showing here is in the frontal area. Remember that I talked about how the prefrontal cortex is used a lot in short-term memory. That in this specific area, they looked at words that people remembered versus words that people forgot. And what they found is that there was more activation in the words that were remembered than the ones that were forgot. So you could ultimately, basically, look at someone's brain activation and predict whether or not they would remember a specific word based purely on how much activation was present in their prefrontal cortex. So the more energy that you have going into encoding, the stronger that memory is going to be. I think trying to think. Yeah, this is basically what I was just kind of articulating there. Another thing that is kind of interesting is that if you have words that are put into a simple sentence versus a complex sentence, you do see some differences in how well people will remember that information. People will not remember the information very well if it is used in a simple sentence. They will remember it much better if it is used in a complex sentence. Why? Because essentially complex sentences they're more complex. They require more attention. They require more cognitive resources for you to be able to kind of understand what that information is. And that's actually really helpful. That's actually going to help, kind of, if we go back, help us increase what's going on in our prefrontal cortex. It stimulates it, essentially, and so we are more likely to remember that stuff. So again, if you're studying and you're trying to think about how you can use this stuff to your advantage, it can be a good thing to make things kind of complicated. Not too complicated, obviously, but to challenge yourself a little bit. You're more likely to remember things that way. All right, that's going to lead us very nicely into working memory. So working memory is basically, I didn't mean to show you that slide, but I guess it doesn't matter too much. So if you think about the activity that you did in the very beginning of this video series for this chapter, I asked you to try to remember certain words, right? So I'm going to give you these words and you can look over them, and I want you to try to remember some of these words. So go ahead and try to remember these words. And then what I want you to do, if you got them in front of you, you can study as much as you like. Then I want you to go and do one of these tests. All of them are interesting. All of them are fun. You can just pick one of them and try it. So pick one of them and try it. And then see how many of those words you remember. So try that. Alright, so I actually I paused this video and I tried to get some of the, you can see I clicked on these links to try to get them to work. The links work, but because some of these were developed a while ago, they want you to use Flash Player, Adobe Flash, and not Chrome does not handle Flash very well. So you may need to open up Mozilla, you may need to open up Microsoft Explorer or Microsoft Edge, whatever, to try it out. That's usually what I do whenever I do the stuff in the classroom. But give it a try. These are working memory tests. They will give you an example of what working memory is, and that way it's super helpful to look at. But yeah, this one right here doesn't need you to turn on or turn off Flash, and so that actually might be the way to go. And it's a digit span task. At any rate, just try it and then think about what your memory is like while you're doing that. That is going to give you a good idea of what working memory is. So while you were doing that, did you forget about these words? These words over here, typically, while we are working on that information, have left our heads, right? We're now focused on something else, and so we forget about these words. Now, we can do different word stems to try to jog our memory, and we'll look a little bit more at that later on. But suffice to say that what working memory is your ability to temporarily store information. So, for example, while you're working on something, these words are not going to be in your memory, right? They're not going to be there because they were temporary. Now you're working on something else. So, working memory is our ability to temporarily store and manipulate information. Again, I like thinking about the functions of it, and I feel like that does a better job of explaining what something is. So an example of working memory is your ability to do mental math. So your ability to multiply 13 times 27 in your head. If you close your eyes and you're doing that math, you're imagining writing it out. That is your working memory. If I were to ask you to look at this right here, if you were to look at this Nintendo Switch and I asked you to imagine if I rotated it a certain direction, that would be an example of mental rotation where you're imagining it turn in your mind's eye. Reading comprehension, so your ability to read and comprehend and think about what it is that you just read and scanned through, that is working memory as well. A lot of times problem solving involves working memory. Lots of these different things are tapping into working memory. And so the working memory that we're mostly going to be talking about today is developed through Baddeley and Hitch. These are two guys in the 70s that developed the initial kind of understanding of working memory, which is essentially that it has three parts to it. That's been revised in more modern days, but these three parts are definitely the most important and the ones that everybody knows. All right, so let's get into what these three pieces are for. And before I do that, in case you are wondering, short-term memory and working memory are generally considered kind of to be the same thing. They are mostly interchangeable. I'm going to be using them interchangeably in this class. You might find some researchers who are going to be very nitpicky about that. That's okay. You're not going to run across any of them in the wild, pretty much. So here is the current kind of understanding of working memory. So you can think about it, and again, we haven't talked about the episodic buffer. That is one of the revised components. I'll tell you about that in a little bit. But the more important thing are going to be these three pieces right here: the visual spatial sketchpad, the central executive, and the phonological loop. All of these things are going to be tied into long-term memory. If we do a good job with these three things, then we can make it fill up our long-term memory. So the first piece that we have here, the visual spatial sketchpad, this is going to be specifically for visual information. So if you did one of the working memory tasks in that link that required you to remember where something was or required you to remember what something looked like, that would be an example of you using your visual spatial sketchpad as a temporary storage area that allows you to look at this stuff in your mind's eye, essentially. So, for example, if I asked you to close your eyes and to imagine you walking to your car from where you are right now, that is an example of visual spatial sketchpad. You're forming up a cognitive map in your mind and you're imagining where to go. That image, that map, is in your visual spatial sketchpad right now. The phonological loop, sometimes called the articulatory loop, is going to be a storage area that is responsible for verbal information. So this is information that is verbal in nature, that you can say, that you can put into words, that you can hear. And so that is like if I were to ask you to remember the number 912-334-1275. That was my old number back in Georgia. If I were to ask you to remember that, 912-334-1275, your ability to rehearse that back to yourself and to try to remember those words or those numbers, that is your phonological loop. You're repeating it in your head. That is what the phonological loop is. So it's more auditory. And then the central executive is going to be the portion of the working memory that is going to allocate attentional resources across these two separate storage systems. So it doesn't really store all that much on its own, but it is going to be responsible for managing a lot of that stuff. Before I move on too much from this, I will tell you a little bit about the episodic buffer. The reason why the episodic buffer is mentioned here is because in the year 2000, so over 25 years after working memory was established and researched, people started finding that there were certain exceptions to some of these rules. And ultimately, the lead author on that paper from the 70s came forward and said, all right, here is how we can imagine working memory, how we can conceptualize it, that helps fix some of the old problems with working memory. Those problems are mostly pretty uncommon and kind of rare, and so I don't want to go into it too much to talk about, but basically the episodic buffer is a way to transfer things from long-term memory straight to this area of working memory that is responsible for handling attention. All right, so the big kind of key feature to Baddeley's model is that these two memory systems, the visual spatial sketchpad and the phonological loop, are separate and independent from one another. In other words, you can remember visual information very well, and you can remember auditory information very well, and you can do that separately. But the moment that you try to memorize more visual information, that is going to interfere with visual memory, and the moment you try to learn more auditory information, that is going to interfere with more auditory memory. So, for example, if I gave you a phone number and asked you to remember it, and you were repeating it to yourself, and I asked you to try to remember how to walk to your car from here, you could do that perfectly fine. You probably wouldn't have any problems with that at all. But if I asked you to try to remember how to walk to your car from here, but also how to simultaneously, I have a spider. Go away, spider. I don't want to kill you. Go away. What was I thinking about? So to walk to your car, if you were then asked to also try to remember, I don't know, how you might drive to Westfield from here. Those two cognitive maps, Westfield University from here, those two cognitive maps are going to compete with one another. They're going to interfere with one another and cause trouble. You can think, we see this all the time when people are trying to remember numbers, and then somebody comes up to you and they start spitting out numbers like 79, 42, 101. I said 101 or 1T1. 1T1, that's 11. 1T1. What am I thinking? It's late. I'm not going to tell you how late it is when I'm recording this stuff, but it's very late. It's past 1T1 p.m. Whenever people spit out numbers like that, it's going to interfere with your ability to remember that phone number you're trying to remember. All right. Okay, so the benefits to Baddeley's model is essentially that it is very simple and straightforward. It's very easy to remember. The downside to that, though, is that there are lots of discrepancies with it and neuroimaging. You can't really find these areas like the phonological loop or the episodic buffer or the visual spatial sketchpad. You can't really find those in the brain per se, so there's not really good neurological evidence for it. And there's other kinds of drawbacks that we'll talk about in just a little bit, but it can't really account for experiences in memory that are not related to vision and hearing. We know we can remember things about how maybe things feel or how they taste, but this doesn't do a very good job at all of explaining how that works, and it doesn't account for lots of abnormal memory conditions like different agnosias or even different kinds of amnesia. So this other piece right here, we're going to come back to this idea that working memory might actually be a mix of intelligence and attention. That is an important conversation that we're going to have in a couple of slides. All right, so there are some drawbacks there, but, this is a very good entry-level way of thinking about memory. Typically, if you were going to dive into these other forms of memory, that would be more graduate level stuff for the most part. I don't even really talk about them too much in my senior capstone because it gets really complicated really, really soon, which is why people really like this model, is because it's mostly pretty simple and pretty straightforward. So the alternative ways of talking about working memory, I'm going to go through 3 different models that are all pretty influential and well cited and well supported. There's different ways of thinking about how working memory works. So Kane and Engel, Randy Kane, and I think Randy Engel and I think it's John Kane. Basically, these guys they got their start at Georgia Tech. These researchers, which is an engineering school, and their focus is much more engineering kind of inspired, I think. Basically, Kane and Engel said that what working memory is simply just your ability to focus your attention mixed with your intelligence. And so the way that I like to try to explain this is to try to imagine having a very high working memory but very low attentional skills. That seems very difficult, right? It seems like a lot of working memory requires the ability to have good attention. And it's also try to imagine having a high working memory but low intelligence. It's hard to imagine that as well. It's a little bit, to me, I think that's easier to imagine. But you get the idea that there's maybe some connection here with our ability to have working memory. And their argument is that a lot of working memory tasks also use attention. So how can we ever be sure that when we are measuring working memory, that what we're not actually measuring is just attention? And again, in case you aren't familiar, you can check out these tests, which are commonly used to study working memory, and try to imagine what it would be like if you did not have good attentional skills. You would do very, very badly on these tests. And also kind of an interesting comparison when we were talking about the chapter about attention, we were talking about the O-span task, which was used in that driving simulator for multitasking. That was developed by these guys, Kane and Engel. All right, so that's one view. The other view is the Cowan view, the Cowan model of memory, working memory. And essentially what Cowan says is that what working memory is simply activated long-term memory. And so this is a little bit kind of disorganized, but I'll try to explain it here, that essentially what Cowan argues is that everything right here is going to be long-term memory. So we have this big space that's just information that's put in our long-term storage. What Cowan argues is that whenever we are focusing our attention on anything in our long-term memory, that is also going to activate other areas around whatever it is that we're focusing on. And those areas that are activated, that are nearby, that is going to be short-term memory or working memory. So basically, in his view, in his research, he shows that we have this sensory store, we have long-term memory, and then within long-term memory, we have different pockets of it that are active, and it's those pockets that are what we think of as short-term memory. So again, this is just a way of conceptualizing it. This one was very, very popular in the late 90s, and it honestly started slowing down in its steam. The Kane and Engel is still very popular. This one is not as popular. Of the three that we're talking about, this is probably the least popular now. But it is very influential because this one really helps set the stage for the next one. And then the final one is the PSYC view of working memory. And sometimes it's called the emergent view of working memory. And essentially, PSYC, he is a neuroimaging researcher, and so his conclusions are basically brought to us from the world of neuroimaging. And what he argues is that essentially what working memory is lots of different parts of the brain that are all acting in conjunction. And so he argues that our sensory memory is basically, if we spend time and put attention on them, that is going to turn that sensory memory into working memory. And so his argument for that is because when we look at short-term memory for specific stimuli, we're going to find that the prefrontal cortex is active, but that these other areas that are responsible for the sensory regions are also active too. So he thinks of the prefrontal cortex as basically the switchboard of attention. And that prefrontal cortex is going to help us kind of focus on these different senses that we have. And as those things are active and as they are activated, that is working memory. So if I were to ask you to imagine what it would be like to walk to your car from here, the areas of your brain that are going to be active in doing that are probably going to be your visual cortex, your prefrontal cortex, and maybe a little bit of the parietal lobe that is used for spatial awareness and things like that, which are the same areas that your visual cortex and your parietal areas, which would also be active if you were perceiving those areas too. All right, I know that can be kind of complicated, but that is kind of the hot theory that people are using these days when we're talking about working memory. Honestly, I don't want to pick favorites. Actually, I do want to pick favorites. This one is my favorite view of working memory, and I like it because it is complicated, but I don't see that as a downside. Just because behavior and the brain is complicated doesn't mean that that's something bad. But that's where we are for that. I find it interesting. I think because we find that going on in the brain, that seems probably to be the one that's most accurate to what's really happening when we are engaging in working memory. Okay, all right, let's talk about long-term memory in the next video, and that will be wrapping it up for this chapter. See you soon.